Welcome back to U.S. History. We're going to pick up real quick with our lesson, starting with capital C, waging war in Europe. And so we left off talking about how Germany tried to invade Russia. They were unsuccessful because of the Russian winter. Russia ends up joining the Allies. And I want you to understand that even though Russia, England, and the United States are on the same side, the British and the Americans don't trust Stalin and the Russians as far as they can throw them, and that's not very far. So it is just a necessary evil, okay, or it's something necessary that they have to ally themselves with Russia. But they are allies at this point, and they're going to try to attack Germany and force Hitler to surrender. Now, Germany invaded North Africa because England was starting to gain a stronghold in that region. And so they sent a field marshal, General Erwin Rommel, who became known as the Desert Fox because of his brilliant strategies using tanks. Rommel was known as a brilliant strategist. Oftentimes he would cover the tanks with burlap sacks that matched the color of the desert, the sand out there in North Africa. And so a lot of times the Allied powers, whenever they were moving throughout the desert, they wouldn't realize that they were walking into a trap because they couldn't see the tanks. Rommel was also an interesting character because he was one of those generals in the German military that did not believe Hitler was at any time going to try to negotiate for peace. He began to wonder as every day of the war went on and as it dragged on, what's going to happen to Germany? Are we going to be able to last in this war? And he began to lose faith in Hitler. And so he was actually a part of a scheme to assassinate Hitler. And he was even among the men that all the people in this assassination plot were wanting to put in charge of Germany. Erwin Rommel, very respected among his peers. However, after the assassination attempt called Operation Valkyrie, after it failed, it turned out that he had been in contact with the assassins or attempted assassins, and he was given a choice. You can either go on trial and your family, if you're found guilty, are going to be killed along with you, or you can commit suicide. We'll give you a military hero's burial and your family will be saved. So he took the choice of suicide by cyanide capsule. And so Erwin Rommel would later die after being connected to that assassination attempt. But Erwin Rommel ended up having to pull out of North Africa, although brilliant strategies that he implemented did not work. And in the end, because he didn't have enough oil. It all came down to oil. And because Hitler was not able to gain control of Russia, Rommel didn't get the oil that he needed in North Africa to get his tanks going. So Dwight D. Eisenhower led American troops in Europe and North Africa, and we see the beginning of the end for the war in Europe with the invasion of Normandy. In your textbooks, on page, let's see here, 464, as I zoom in. Joint forces consisting of American forces, Canadian forces, also, let's see here, and British forces. You have this invasion of Normandy, which is called D-Day. And so they sailed across the English Channel on June 6, 1944, and landed on different parts of the beaches in Normandy. On page 464, it says that the Americans soldiers landed on beaches codenamed Utah and Omaha, and then the British and Canadians landed on the other nearby beaches codenamed Juno, Gold, and Sword. Now, the German defenses were strong, and it was no easy feat landing on the beaches. What we had were these transport boats. You can see here in this picture, men just piled into these transport boats heading toward the beach in Normandy. And what was awaiting them were entrenched German forces that had machine guns and all types of artillery. When this door would drop down on the beach, these men were facing certain death. It was a stronger chance that they would die than survive getting off of this boat. Many of these men knew that it was probably the end. My cousin told me a story that whenever he was growing up, there was a man who was a World War II veteran, and I forgot what his name was. But he remembered him asking, because he had seen Saving Private Ryan, that movie. He said, was that accurate? And the man answered him and he said, he goes, it really wasn't that accurate. He goes, because there wasn't as much cussing as there was in the movie. He said there wasn't as much cussing because it was all men praying. He said he heard more men praying. He said there was no cussing going on. People were praying because they knew they were probably going to die at that point. And so he said the movie was not accurate in that aspect. There wasn't hardly any language in these transport boats. It was just people praying. But neat story there. And so once we were able to establish a beachhead on the beaches of Normandy, we were able to push the Germans back mile by mile. And we headed eastward toward Paris. Toward Paris here, which had been captured, of course, by the Germans. And so then we began pushing eastward toward Germany while the Russians began pushing westward. And so we were going to try to meet together, okay, in the middle and meet in Berlin, which Russia would end up getting there first. But one of the major battles that was fought during this time was the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge. And this took place in France during the winter months. Let's see here. Oh, I'm sorry. Not in France. It says in Belgium. Okay, so in the town of Bastogne. So they're there fighting for months. In the snow, in the severe cold. And so the Germans were really wanting to break through the American lines there. Now, the reason why we call it the Battle of the Bulge, let's see if I can bring this up here, is because the American forces had one strong line. The German forces are over here. Let's see. Sorry. Here's the German forces. And so the Germans want to concentrate their attacks on the middle, which is where they believe the weakest part of the American lines are. And if they can break through this line, then they'll separate the American forces. And so let's see if we can go back here. And so whenever the Germans try to push through the middle of the line, what it does is it creates a little bulge, okay, there in the American lines, and it pushes them back. But the American forces were able to hold strong, withstand the German attack, and eventually push the Germans back, moving into German territory, thus winning the Battle of the Bulge. Okay, now, what I failed to mention was that in D-Day, we had about 10,000 casualties, 6,603 of them being American casualties. Then we have the Yalta Conference. This was basically a convention where Winston Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met to discuss what the Soviets wanted in return for their help. And so Winston Churchill even warned Roosevelt. He said, we can't appease Stalin. We saw what happened when we tried to appease Hitler. It didn't work. But Roosevelt said, no, it's necessary that we come to an agreement so that the Russians will help us, even though the Russians never ended up keeping any of their promises. Churchill said, if we give them any territory, they're going to keep it, and all of the people who live in that territory will be put under communism. He said an iron curtain will descend over Europe, separating the communist portion of Europe and the free capitalistic portion of Europe. Now, once Hitler found out that there was no way out, this was after, I'm trying to remember how many days after he sees Berlin fall. Okay, so on May 2nd, 1945, Berlin fell to the Russians. 2 days before that, Hitler had committed suicide because he saw the Third Reich, everything he had built crumbling before his eyes. So Germany surrendered 2 days later. It wasn't until the Americans were able to move eastward after the Battle of the Bulge and move into Germany, that they found the concentration camps. These concentration camps, several of them being named Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau, also Ravensbrück. If you've read the Diary of Anne Frank, you are familiar with this. This is where Hitler's attempted extermination of the Jews, political prisoners, homosexuals, any of those people, they were placed in concentration camps. But mainly this was an attempt to exterminate the Jews. And so this is where American soldiers, British soldiers, they found starved, tortured, and thousands upon thousands of dead Jews here in these concentration camps. And so we call this event, the attempted extermination of the Jews, we call it the Holocaust. This is why we should be very careful about laughing or making any types of jokes concerning hatred toward the Jews, or even jokes about the Holocaust. This was an awful, awful period of time where 6 million Jews were killed by Hitler and his men during World War II. Awful, awful circumstance here. And so one interesting fact is that a lot of the Americans, when they saw these starved Jewish people, these prisoners, they could see their bones. It was just terrible. They tried to start giving them food, but doctors quickly rushed to them and said, "You can't feed them." They said, if you feed, their stomachs are so small because they've been starved for so long that if they were to eat a lot of food at one time, their stomachs would burst and they would die. So in order to keep them alive, they couldn't feed these prisoners right away. And so it was a terrible situation. The Holocaust, one thing that I really was upset about not being able to go on our Washington, D.C. trip is that we weren't able to visit the Holocaust Museum. It is a life-changing museum, seeing what these people went through and the evils of the Third Reich and Hitler and his belief that the Jews were an inferior race and his decision to try to exterminate their race. So awful. And so there's so many stories that we could go into with the Holocaust. I encourage you to read about it if you're interested. But we have to move on here. VE Day. VE Day stands for Victory in Europe Day. And this is whenever we were able to take over Germany. Germany surrendered, and VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. This was in 1945 when Berlin fell. And so what we've set ourselves up for at this point is that the Russians have swooped in from the east. The Russians swooped in from the east and captured East Berlin, and the Allies came in and captured West Berlin. And so even though we were allies, once we captured Berlin, Russia is going to try to take as much territory as they can. They're eventually going to set the line where we are no longer allowed into their territory. And so we start a new war after World War II ends, and that new war is called the Cold War. But we'll pick up with that in the next chapter. And tomorrow we will start covering America Wins in the Pacific. All right, and again, I'm sorry that I'm having to rush through all this. It's killing me that I'm not able to teach like I would in a classroom. In a classroom, I get 45 minutes to talk about all of this and in detail. But here I am on a time limit with how much I can give you. So I apologize. Again, if you want to see more, you can go watch World War II in color on Netflix. Great documentary. Take care. Stay safe.